Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
Hello, and welcome to Cahnmanns Current Events Roundtable. Today we have a wonderful guest, and I'm so happy that Rabbi Michael Sommer is here to help me to understand myself as well as my viewers, to understand what is going on as far as anti-Semitism today. We're calling the show The Resurgence of Anti-Semitism, and it is 2018, and we're trying to figure out, or I'm trying to figure out, and I've talked to many other people, why today? Why is it happening? And it happened many years ago when I was growing up, where Jewish people you couldn't rent an apartment. You had a very hard time to rent an apartment to somebody that was Jewish. And now it's starting all over again. And Rabbi, I know you don't consider yourself an expert, but I consider you more of an expert than most people. You are a rabbi, and I'm really happy that you're here today. Welcome.
Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for having me today.
So maybe you're here to answer, and I know you're here to answer many questions, and I wrote a few questions down, and I want you to address them because I think it's very important to really understand what is happening. So maybe you need to answer this question: where do you see the resurgence of anti-Semitism in America coming from?
You see a lot of sentiment rising due to the perceived immigration problems. You see people feeling like they're losing their sense of national identity, like they're losing their country. And so part of that fear, people fall back on anti-Semitism, on there being some kind of Jewish conspiracy in the world to alter or change their lives, because Jews, for the most part, historically, have always been immigrants. So you see it in the Great Dispersion, when Rome destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70. Jews are dispersed even further throughout the world. And so for centuries, we were always the stranger in countries and in cities and seen as other. And so you have a lot of that passed down historically as Jews being seen as the outsider. And so there are many within the world that still see the Jewish people as outsiders and as the cause of their problems, and they latch onto that to blame us for their lives, their problems, their governments, even though the Jewish people as a whole throughout the world are less than 0.25% of 1% population in the entire world. We're one of the smallest religious populations in the world.
It's interesting because we've been here for so long in the United States, America, and to be blamed for, say, in fact, the Tree of Life synagogue attack, the Jews were possibly, blamed for, they got, because they were supposedly on the side of the caravan. That was one of the reasons that was given to me when I was asking around that the caravan, it was Jewish people were pro, because, again, we're going back to the immigration, because Jewish people were immigrants at one time, but so were the Italians, and so were the Irish and the Polish people. Why is it thrown back on the Jews? Why, first of all, I see Jewish, maybe people see Jews as a nationalism or Jewish is a religion. But, why are we given that identity? Why is it that, no one else is blamed for it except the Jewish people? Because we weren't the only immigrants around.
Because Jews have suffered persecution throughout history, we are often the loudest voice in open societies where you can protest a lack of equal rights or discrimination. So in America, Jews have often been to the forefront of movements towards ending some kind of discrimination. You see major rabbis and Jews that marched with Martin Luther King Jr. for the civil rights movement. You see us advocating for tolerance and acceptance of all lifestyles, and you see us in equality of marriage. And so anyone who sees that as a push against or a degradation of their beliefs or their religion sees the Jews as the destroyers of what they imagine America to be.
Now, do you see the Jewish people that when they criticize Israel, is Israel being criticized because it's a country? People are criticizing the country, or are they criticizing Jews? Is anti-Semitism and anti-Israel the same, or is it separate?
Part of it is the same. The anti-Israel, anti-Zionism is a new form of anti-Semitism where people try to say that I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just against Israel and Israel's policies when it comes to the Palestinian people. And Hezbollah and Hamas have created a large amount of propaganda to make the Palestinians look like the Davids of history and Israel to look like the Goliath of history. And they fail to show how much violence has come out of Palestine, how the PLO was a leading terrorist organization in the 1970s, how Israel, starting with the Oslo Accord, was working towards peace and working towards making sure the territories were viable for the Palestinian people. And it's not shown in the education, like within this propaganda movement, that the Palestinian government, that Hamas and Hezbollah are not holding up their end of the peace agreement. So you get this anti-Israel and anti-Zionist rhetoric as if we're to blame for the plight of the Palestinians, and it completely avoids talking about how their government has used the people as shields.
Exactly, because we were talking today at the Bluegrass restaurant, my favorite restaurant. We were talking today about the United Nations and how they blame the human rights violations in Israel, yet China has the most human rights violations of any country. One of the most countries is China. And of course, they're not talking about China. They're not talking about Saudi Arabia, that also has human rights violations, and other Middle Eastern countries. Yet they continue to dwell on Israel being an apartheid nation, and the BDS movement, which is boycott, divestment, and sanction Israel. And it seems like the Jews are always to blame, Israel's always to blame. Why is it? You said this happened so many years ago, and it's coming back to haunt us again.
With the United Nations, you have all the Muslim countries vote as a bloc. So Israel is always cited for human rights violations, and none of the Muslim countries are cited for human rights violations, or larger countries.
But there's so many of them there.
There's so many violations, but they're not held up. So when you can have that many countries vote against one democratic country that happens to be the only Jewish country in the world, where every citizen can vote, no matter what your religion, what your nationality. If you are an Israeli citizen, you have a vote, you have incredible women's rights, and equality for all humans who are considered Israeli citizens. When you have that many countries that can vote against the one democratic country in the Middle East, they can say whatever they want.
But this is hitting the United States. By them, the United Nations and attacking Israel, I think this represents the Jewish people even here, and the Jewish people here are getting criticized because of that.
Right. When you have the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement funded, but the sources of their funding aren't really revealed, although a lot of the sources come from outside of the country, and you have the propaganda of that movement trying to make Israel look like in such a bad lighting, then it's all one-sided. When you have students that don't understand what is going on and don't understand the history, as soon as you call Israel an apartheid state, it just shows that you don't understand what an apartheid state is. Israel is nothing like, South Africa in the last century, and what apartheid was about. Israel is a democratic society. All we're asking for is that the Palestinian government put down all weapons and stop the violence in Israel so that we can create a real peace. But you have a country and a government that in their bylaws is the complete destruction of Israel. So you don't have a country that wants the same things as Israel, but you have a great propaganda movement that in America, where the little country, the smaller country, the less advanced country is the victim and Israel is the aggressor, Israel is constantly seen as the bad country and the Palestinians are seen as the victims.
Do you see it? Because here in the United States, and I know I have grandsons that go to universities, and one of my grandsons pointed it out to me that it's being taught it was one of my grandson from Texas was taught in his college, his university that he was going to, that the professors are teaching that. They're actually teaching that the Palestinians are, they're being aggressed upon by Israel. They're the aggressors. And so a lot of this is being taught to our college students. In fact, I want to point out something that I don't know if we can see this, but a camera can go on this. If you can't, it's okay too. In Baraboo, Wisconsin's students giving the Nazi salute before their prom this spring. And it was all about the Wisconsin high schoolers giving the Hitler salute and the problem of ironic Nazism. And this is what happens when memory of the Holocaust fades, and it's not being taught. The Holocaust, what happened at the Holocaust is not being taught, yet it's being taught that Israel is the aggressor. So you're seeing students, I would say there's many students here. Most of them are giving the Nazi salute, some are not. And yet there was there was not an assembly afterwards, or a teacher or a superintendent of schools or a principal that reprimanded any of these students for what happened. And as it was said, they thought it was a joke. But really, was it a joke? Did they really understand what they were doing? Did they learn it from their parents? Or it was just something they saw on a television show? They've done this in a lot of these comedy shows. They're putting, for instance, I've gotten things in the mail, on my email, as far as putting Donald Trump in a Hitler uniform. So they're seeing a lot of this stuff going on today in their emails or their other accounts that they use. What do you see that's happening at the schools? And part of it's responsible for the anti-Semitism of today.
Well, even seeing there was propaganda posters put out that show the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu equating him with Hitler. And you see in a class like this that not only does it show a lack of understanding from these high school students, but the fact that they don't even understand that they're probably denigrating the memory of their grandparents or great-grandparents who fought in World War II and fought against Nazism and fascism, and understanding what that was. So this symbol denigrates what their ancestors did to keep the world safe from Nazism and fascism, what America fought for during World War II, and it shows a complete lack of understanding. You have school systems throughout the world where the education, Holocaust education, is being removed because you have Muslim communities protesting that they don't believe it should be taught in the schools. So when you make history as propaganda and you can remove how history is taught because you have a side trying to show that there's a Jewish agenda versus you're trying to show what happened during World War II and how one country singled out one people in the world and tried to eradicate them from all of Europe, you often don't get the history of how there were Muslim allies of the Germans that were all about erasing the Jews from Egypt and erasing the Jews from the Middle East, that it didn't dawn on them that the Nazis, if they had won, probably just would have continued with them after World War II. So you fast forward to today, and you have a lack of understanding of what the Nazi salute means, of what it means to be a neo-Nazi, and you see the movement of white supremacists increasing their activity and their vocalism about what they think is a Jewish agenda. You hear in Charlottesville, they were chanting on the news that Jews will not replace us, that they've been taught about whatever this, agenda is that doesn't exist, that we're trying to replace them, which has to come from a place of being taught hatred, being taught anti-Semitic beliefs, being taught that, in their world, whatever their pain, their suffering, that they think that this small percentage of people in the world actually would want to replace them, that they feel the fear of this.
And you see we were also talking about the left point, the extreme left point of view with Antifa, where they're, they were down there also in Charlottesville, and they were throwing things on the statues, kicking them, throwing paint, whatever. They were trying to destroy. That's the opposite point of view, which was about their beliefs of also the Palestinians and that Israel is the aggressor and so so we had 2 points of view during, I think, Charlottesville. There was the right with the Nazi KKK representation, and then there was the left where the Antifa was represented there. That was the kids, from Antifa, and they were wearing the hoodies or whatever they usually wear. So you had 2 points of view going on. Meanwhile, they brought the statues down, and for people, some of the statues, like I think you mentioned that President Lee really didn't want a statue of himself, but Lee represented the South as far as a lot of Southerners and even Southern Jewish people, because I lived in the South, and they were very pro-Lee, because I would say, well, who didn't the North win the war? And they said, absolutely not, the South won the war, okay? So there was always that back and forth when I lived in the South. They, this is amongst Jewish people, not just Christian people believing that. So when they demolished the statues, some of the statues of the Confederate War, it was pretty devastating, maybe not to us living in the North, but people that, that their grandfathers were in that, in the Confederate War, so they have a history as well.
But General Lee never wanted statues put up. He wanted the country to heal from the wounds of the Civil War. The statues are sort of a rewriting of history from 1900 to the 1930s. Confederate War statues were put up. And so it was a rewriting of the war, rewriting of the history, making the South seem patriotic. But they want to feel patriotic, because if you go down there, you see all, American flags, Confederate flags, they have museums with history, lots of history, depending on where you go in the South. There's a lot of... Right, but if we're still fighting the Civil War in 2018, when we're supposed to be a United States of America, where all citizens are working towards a tolerant and accepting country, and you still have a faction of Americans that don't want to be accepting and don't want to be tolerant. The use of the Civil War statues, that they don't know the history, that they were put up way after the Civil War. And again, if you have generally not want statues of himself, if you have someone who fought in the war, saw the worst of the war, and wanted the country to be able to heal, and that we're still not healed in 2018, then you have a continuation of sort of false histories being taught to individuals who think that this nation was theirs, right? If you ask any of the First Nations the amount of pain that they suffered from the immigrants from other countries coming in and appropriating the United States of America, the United States of America was always a melting pot. Like, there were always many different races and colors living in this country. It's not the way they see it in their minds and what they've been taught with their...
I guess we're still fighting a little bit of the Civil War in Charlottesville. I think that's probably what happened. You know, the ones that wanted to take it down felt the way you're describing it, and other ones, but they took it down the wrong way. What I think they should have done, maybe removed them and put them in a museum or in an historical museum of some kind, rather than demolish them. They were a piece of art. I mean, as far as somebody made them and casted them, and with a lot of work doing them. You know, if you want to put down history instead of just, you know, taking and crashing them down and doing such damage to them, they could have been removed to an
Right.
historical site.
And I think, you know, you mentioned the anti-fascist movement, and you mentioned them both being in Charlotte, but when the argument is in yelling and rhetoric, it's one thing. When it gets to violence, and when you have one side drive a car into the middle of a protest and kill someone just because they hold opposing views, our country is supposed to be a place where you can have opposing views and it doesn't lead to violence. When you have any side getting to violence, and you have one side, you know, the fascist movement, the white supremacist movement, want to get to violence because you can't, this country's not going to go back ever to a predominantly white country. Their fear of their existence, no one is really coming after their existence or their way of life, but it's this fear as if the cities where there's such diversity and when there's a greater population are trying to change their lives where they live.
But I see this as younger people. It isn't our age group that's doing it. It's a younger group, and I think it goes back. I think we started talking about the school system and what they're getting taught in colleges, and I think a lot of this goes back to going back to the schools. These kids are not getting taught the right thing. They're not understanding what's happening. They think, you know, taking down statues, protesting. I know we have the First Amendment, which is the First Amendment. You know, that we have the right to
Free speech.
Free speech, right? Thank you. But what is free speech? Is it to hurt other people? Is it to make people feel bad about who they are? What is free speech? And I think some of these schools are not teaching, going back to Charlottesville, what are they teaching in Charlottesville? What are they teaching the students there that did so much damage? What are they teaching what are they teaching around the Tree of Light Synagogue and what was going around there? Why is it not being addressed in elementary school, high school, and especially the colleges with professors that are putting down Israel?
I mean, in University of California, Berkeley right now, you have a professor who's teaching how to erase Israel. And in Charlottesville, I'm not sure it's the teachers teaching it. A lot of people came in from outside of Charlottesville to protest the removal of the statue. You often have a lot of people coming from outside.
But they're younger
to
people.
protest.
They're younger people, most of them.
You see it of all age. Like, yes, like they're young, but even the fact, I think, most of all, what a lot of these protests have shown is how much division there is in the country right now.
And who's sponsoring this? Who's paying these people to come out? There are paid people that come out and protest because they get paid for it too. So who's sponsoring a lot of these groups? You know, some of these kids are coming out by themselves because they see it happening and they're just joining. But there are a lot of paid people that are, you know, protesting because they're getting paid to do it, and that's not being addressed. Who's sponsoring all this damage and protests and, you know, First Amendment screaming and yelling and, you know, tearing down different religions and faiths and, you know, and races? Who is doing this? See, that's really important to address too, because I don't know. I personally don't know, but there are people that are doing this. Probably people our age that are encouraging, you know, I'm sure it's somebody that's older that's doing that, somebody that has the money to do so.
Right. You probably have connections to, again, Hamas and the Palestinian government. You probably have connections to Iran, funding the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the student unions that you see for Free Palestine and Students for Palestine on the campuses, that because of that funding, like, they're able to have large protests against Israel, as well as control the message. And once you can take that message and spread it to people who have no idea about the history, who are just freshmen on campus or have never been to college before, and you convince them that, you know, the small country is the victim and the big country is the aggressor. Israel suffered over 400 rocket attacks in the last month.
Right, right.
And didn't go to war. If, you know, Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin fired 400 rockets into Illinois, I don't think we'd be sitting here calmly by right now if any country did that. God forbid another country on any of the borders of America shot 400 rockets into America. We would not be sitting idly by. But Israel is seen as the aggressor, and the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist rhetoric that comes across as the sort of this new anti-Semitism overlooks that. They blame Israel for causing those 400 rockets to be fired into Israel.
Well, we have a little bit of time. What do you see happening? How can anti-Semitism be addressed, and so that we can start to heal from it? What do you see that we should do, what the people should do, what our country should do? What do you see?
I don't know that you're going to see healing for a long time. I think it has raised awareness. I think we are all aware that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel fervor is a lot worse than we thought it was, and that after the Tree of Life synagogue shootings, we don't feel as safe. So many synagogues now have higher security protocols. They have guards on duty, where they may have been one or two open doors to come and visit a synagogue. You now have one locked door with an armed guard standing at that door, all because of one man buying into all the anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish rhetoric, white nationalism that's going around right now, and feeling that he had to take up his arm and go and shoot up a bunch of innocent people and kill them on the Sabbath while they're just praying, while they're utilizing their religious freedom to pray peacefully in a community. And whatever he'd been taught, he chose to go violent and become murderous of a people that never even knew him, like would never do him harm, but all the propaganda, all the anti-Semitism convinced him that they were the cause of all the things he
So you
disagreed
don't
with.
see it getting better, you see it getting worse? Is that what you're saying?
It's going to get worse before it gets better. We're not in a place of healing, we're in a place of awareness and starting to wake up that this was there all along. It just wasn't as vocal. And now, based on politics throughout the world, it's become much more acceptable for nationalism and fascism and anti-Semitism to be vocal in many different countries right now.
It's too bad, because we really need to heal. I think, I think it should start in the schools. I think that's very important, because we have a whole new group of children coming into this world, and I think it should start there. Rabbi, we have so much to cover, and I see that we're coming to the end of our show. We have to wrap up our show. And I want to invite you back as our guest again to go over, and hopefully the next time you come, you'll have much better news for us. Maybe there will be some kind of a healing. Again, thank you for coming and addressing a very, very difficult subject, anti-Semitism, the resurgence of it. And I invite you back to continue our topic because I think it's a much needed